Good afternoon. Good day. I will now moderate the following panel. We have Vanessa Rubio. It's a pleasure to introduce her. She teaches at Nottingham School of Economics. She's an associate fellow at Chatham House, which is well known in Mexico. She is a sub-minister of tax authorities. And it is a pleasure to introduce her to moderate this panel from London. Hello, Sergio. It is always a pleasure to work with you as we have done for so many years. And a warm greeting to Chatham House and all the organizers of this event in Comexi and HSBC and CAF. Good morning, Mexico, and good afternoon, Davos, where Patricio Espinosa is joining us from. And also those joining us from London, where I myself am. We will be talking about the environment and its impact in Latin America, the commitments to 2026, and the role of the private sector in this regard. We will have a number of presentations. I will tell you who is speaking and what the position is. We have Patricia Espinosa, Executive Director of the United Nations Conference on Climate Change, Gabriel Viorio, Sub-Secretary of the Tax Authorities in Mexico, Ms. Caldet, from Director of Finances at HSBC, and Alberto de la Fuente, who's President of the Executive Council of Global Companies and General Director of Shell Mexico. This is the best possible group of people to talk about climate change and the private sector. We have those in charge of the financial side, the energetics, public sector, and global companies. So we have the best possible group of people, truly. I'll begin with Patricia. COP is a process, and this is oftentimes misunderstood. This is a monumental task. It's so difficult. One moves forward, one step forward, one step back. There's opportunities, there's challenges, but this is a process. It is something that is built, and you have been a part of this process for 6 years now. And I would like to know, what progress do you see in that regard as of COP26, and what challenges do you see in this for the conference that will be held in Egypt? We have had a panel here at Chatham House with the great big challenges that we face at a geopolitical, economic, financial levels have been talked about, and the competition for resources, for construction, for development, for sustainable development. So where do you see this going, and what should our expectations be? Thank you so much. Thank you, Vanessa. Thank you. Thanks for the invitation to participate today here. And I thank you for your kind words. And specifically what you said about COP being a process. This is a multilateral process following on the actions of the international community vis-a-vis climate change. And this is a process which is highly intense, because we hold our convention yearly, and when the decision was reached to hold a conference every year, the objective doubtless was to avoid a loss of focus on the issue of climate change. This is 30 years now, and 30 years ago, we knew that it was important to not lose our focus in this regard. It is important then also to understand that conferences are not just conferences. They are a time in which the international community comes together to evaluate where we're at, and decisions are made, forward-facing decisions are made. and the issue of climate change will continue to be a key issue in the international agenda for a long time to come, up until a time at which we do not have to talk about climate financing, because all financing will be seen through a focus of risk evaluation in such terms. So the report that was presented at Davos places climate change among the highest risks internationally, and most of all the lack, the inaction around climate change. And I thank you for this opportunity to talk to you. Where are we at? COP26 was very important. It was there was a stark transition. There was a negotiation period when we had to be focused on negotiations. This was the conference at which, after 6 years of intense negotiations, we got to a point at which we concluded the rules for the implementation of the Paris Accord, which established the general framework. But the rules for its implementation took a further 6 years. A very important topic here, one of the last to be fully resolved, was that of exchange markets. That is now done. And we also have a framework on transparency, a strengthened framework on transparency, which allows for more transparency in following up on the efforts of the international community. Beyond that, beyond having concluded this rule book, the Glasgow conference also established a clear path on the areas we must continue to work on, so as to meet with the Paris Accord objectives that we have agreed upon. The Paris Accord, to refresh your memory, speaks about the need to work on mitigating global warming in the measure that it is possible to a maximum of 1.5 degrees, maximum of maybe 2. And the international panel set this goal. And this report states quite clearly that the 2-degree scenario is catastrophic. Reason for which we are now focusing on a 1.5-degree goal instead of 2 degrees. The decisions, the Glasgow Pact, which was approved, is a balanced package, and that is how it must be seen in terms of the global warming regime. This has a number of moving pieces. We cannot move forward on one aspect of this without leaving the rest behind. This is to do with adaptation, the means for the implementation, including financing. In terms of adaptation, the Glasgow Accord clearly delineated a process to define a global goal in terms of adaptation. We have mitigation. We have goals for mitigation. We want to get to 1.5 degrees, but in terms of adaptation, we do not have clear goals. This is one of the key objectives that we must maybe not solve fully, but we must have a clear project for that emanating from COP27. And for the very first time, we had an agreement to take on the topic of losses derived from global warming. There had been intense resistance from developed countries because a great many of them feared that this could become a platform for developing countries to to demand compensations for losses, but it has been acknowledged that this affects not only developing countries, but also countries throughout all latitudes in terms of technical assistance, and eventually also to try to identify ways of providing financial support to the countries who suffer such financial losses. We have also agreed, given how far we are from this goal, this 1.5 degree goal, the, the mitigation plans for each country must be evaluated not every 5 years. It's been contemplated in the Paris Accords. This must be an ongoing thing. And the Glasgow Pact, countries who have not presented a national plan which is kept up to date and with more stringent goals. And for those who have done so, it urges them to keep working to identify areas of opportunity that allows for these goals to be more ambitious. And here what we're talking about is a scenario of growth in terms of emissions, which is 14% in 2030, according to these plans, which is far from what we need. It is for the very first time in history, in terms of mitigation, this Glasgow Pact, that it included the mandate to reduce the use of non-abated carbon and also to eliminate any subsidies that are not efficient, as well as the importance of launching a mass deployment of renewable energy technologies. These topics had not previously been touched upon in the context of these conversations, and the way that we finally were able to achieve recently. And in terms of financing, this was the area where the result was less than satisfactory, and the reason for that is that commitment to mobilize $100 billion that was taken on in 2019 at the Copenhagen conference, and which was formalized in the Cancun conference in 2010, was not respected. Developed countries presented a report which contains a plan for compliance with this goal for 2023, but as you can imagine, this plan was received with skepticism and frustration by developed countries. So what I have to say here is that the package that we adopted in Glasgow is far from perfect. It has its positives and its negative points also, and its characteristics, it is defined by these multilateral processes. But the most important is that current international conditions do not allow for optimism in terms of what we can achieve, what we can accomplish in terms of financing this year in order to moving into the 27th edition of the conference. Thank you, Patricia, for your opening remarks. And this sets the table to ask the Undersecretary, Gabriel Viorio, about this topic. How, in Glasgow, the negotiation moved forward quite significantly, but now we must move on to the more concrete aspect of this, which is implementation, and this necessarily goes through accelerated commitment in terms of financing, more ambitious financing. So, Gabriela, I would like to ask, what is your stance here? in terms of the magnitude of what is needed in terms of financing and the shared responsibility that this comes along with, and the big challenges around this, such as lessened economic growth, a geopolitical crisis, inflation, debt, lower interest rates, taxes. This is highly challenging, to say the least. In the context of growing demand for the growing need for financing to meet all of these demands. So, Gabriel, please, if you could share your stance on this. For sure, and thank you for the invitation and the chance to talk about this and the challenges in climate financing. And I will tell you a little bit about the conversations here in Mexico, especially in the context of the international agenda. I would like to focus on 3 points before talking about climate financing. After COVID, the vast majority of debates on recovery were focused on green recovery, which means investment in infrastructure, accelerating the energetic transition. And we have a very important issue here at the international level in terms of agenda, because there is a perception which says that the climate agenda has been dominated by developed countries, and the developed countries have a clear stance that this should be focused on energy policy, which has left other aspects by the wayside, such as biodiversity and the seas and oceans. And green growth will not only be mediated by the energy transition, but the transition in the energy sector, but also other actions that we will have to implement. But who has to do that? And that is the great big question that we brought to the forth at G20 and other such spaces. The vast majority of global growth will be emerging countries. Emerging countries do not only face the changes that will come from climate change, but also social issues. We have important challenges that we must resolve in the short term. So when we speak of climate financing in the international agenda, this is focused mainly on financing for low-income countries. So multilateralism and the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank has been focused on these countries. Emerging countries has to seek their resources in markets. They do not necessarily have access to the funds, the amounts that have been established for these objectives, which are usually focused on low-income countries. So one of the positions Mexico has taken in such debates is that globally, if we want green, sustainable growth, we must not only focus on climate change, but we must also have the ability to include social aspects in the discussion. So what we have been talking about is sustainability, social gaps. They're all highly focused issues, focalized issues. If we're to talk about this, it is not only emerging countries that will have access to such resources. We will have to get resources from markets. So this becomes a rather philosophic pain point in a world global, because there is a risk prime on sovereign states, and this credit will end up being greater. This financing will be greater for developed countries. So advanced economies such as the United States and the European Union and Japan, up until before the impact that we have seen from COVID and wars, they've had rates very close to zero. And when we see the current economic situation, what we see is that low-income countries will have to raise funds from international markets, but the cost will be higher to them. So if all the projects that we are working on, if it is to have an impact on climate change, and if this is to be global emerging countries in a cost-benefit analysis, cost will be higher for emerging countries than for developed countries. So if we look at the current financial order, there's no de-risking, as financiers may say, in terms of financing around climate change. So we have to finance not only the fight against climate change, we also must finance the closing of social gaps, but it will be more expensive for us than for more advanced economies. And it is in this context that I would say that the decision that we have, the stance that we have taken in Mexico, and before going on to the topic of financing, is that in all of these multilateral arenas, we have been trying to make a case for de-risking, and we have presented some ideas. There's nothing has been concretized in there, but we have been working with think tanks in Washington, and one of the key ideas here that came up is to use a structure of guarantees so as to guarantee financing for emerging countries, so as to accomplish as much as possible in terms of financing to mitigate climate change, climate risk. This is our vision. This is the vision that we have shared with other emerging countries, and what we have been talking about as emerging countries in the main global forums such as COP26 and G20. What are we doing in Mexico? We made a decision at the tax authorities, and now we'll steal a phrase from Patricia. She said we have to normalize this. So the day that we stop talking about climate change, that means success. This is not a mere trend. More and more, we are forced to incorporate these criteria in public and private corporations. So more and more, we see important challenges in terms of access to liquidity, but those who provide liquidity cannot meet with such criteria in the decision making. That is the reason that we have implemented an approach that we call sustainable finance here in Mexico. This is not only an emission of sustainability bonds, which are linked to ODS, the ODS bond from Europe. What we truly are trying to accomplish is to constitute a market where all of the resources of an economy are mobilized under this umbrella. And this means not only efforts from the federal government and the private sector, but all sectors of our society. And the prime candidate for that is the financial sector. So what have we done? From the point of view of the public sector, we have annexed an additional layer on our results-based budgeting. We have metrics for that. So what we have added is a new layer for ODS, Sustainable Development Objectives. So we have a focus, results-based metrics approach where we can measure an impact. We seek to have direct impact here. And so we have goals for sovereign emissions. And this is unique in the world because this will be linked to bonds. So what we do it ex ante and ex post. We do both. And so we have green bonds and social bonds, which allows for the framework to be highly flexible in order for the government to adjust according to priorities in the moment. So that is the first step that we made. It was not done in terms of mobilizing public resources. The second step is we want to look at all the resources from banks in terms of financing to be done via ASG criteria. So we are using the regulatory branch at the tax authorities. The first step was to limit pension funds, or force them to include such criteria in their investments. So they're buying assets in the Mexican market. And the second step that we're taking is, and we're in the process of implementing, is to have sustainable taxonomies in order to, such that banks may have a common vocabulary as to what is social, what is green, what is sustainable, and this will allow us to have top quality green assets in our market. And so what we did was to bring European bonds to the Mexican market. We have the same framework. We're bringing the whole framework, importing it into our market to issue sovereign bonds with sustainable criteria, and hopefully it is by the end of this year that we will have fixed rate green bonds along those lines. So with the reference curves for sustainable development, corporations may now start designing financing programs around climate change, social issues, sustainability issues, blue economy, orange economy. This is what will create the reference point for low-risk investments in pesos. So that is our objective. Underlying all of this is not only the objective to mobilize resources, which we obviously want to accomplish, but beyond that, we want to get to a place where we have a whole market where companies with specific sustainability goals to be able to find financing for their programs. And in closing, I would say that what we have learned is that efforts cannot be, they must be multilateral. We must all get involved, and we need to create the financial opportunities to provide resources for such efforts, and this must be done fast. We are now running a pilot phase for carbon bonds. We have a pilot program that we have been putting together with the United Kingdom, and we are in talks to also implement this with the government of Singapore. So what we want to get to is to develop a whole new market there. And in closing, once again, we have a project, we have the infrastructure for project finance in Mexico. We want to start developing carbon markets and impact bonds, which is to say that we have set the structure for the Mexican financial market to move completely to this model, depending on the objectives of companies or anybody else wishes to take. That these have been our efforts, and I believe this has also been acknowledged in the international arena. Mexico has been acknowledged for its innovation in sustainable financial instruments, and this is something that Mexican corporations will now be able to make use of, and this is it for me. Thank you very much. No, thank you, Gabriel, for your words. I believe that much progress has been made at a great many levels, but there's a question. It seems that there are two tracks here. One is climate change and the other is financing. And I was taking notes just now. In the previous session, when we were talking about the economy, nobody mentioned about green recovery, nobody mentioned about the circular economy, nobody mentioned energy transmission, nobody spoke of sustainable economy. So I think that climate change cannot merely be a chapter. It must be at the heart of the very way we think, the way we regulate, the way we implement, the way we evaluate risk. I don't know what your experience has been here, but when I was at the Sustainability Council for the financial sector, there was never a risk evaluation related to climate change. So all of these actions is still severely lacking. But this is the beginning. This is something that will continue to grow. We will now go on to Mario. The financial sector has, at a systematic level, has these issues at a systematic level. The financial sector makes investment decisions, structural decisions. It lends money. It, it boosts certain projects, insurance, and so on and so forth. So it generates a system. So what do we need to do to get to a place where it has this vision for sustainability? What would you say based on your experience, so many years in this sector, along these lines? How can we get to a point at which the actions of the financial sector are truly where we need them to be at in terms of meeting with this challenge? What do we need in the financial sector to take on climate risk? Thank you very much.
Thank you, Vane. It's a pleasure to welcome you at HSBC and to share with my co-panelists, whom I admire a great deal. As Vanessa said, if we go back to 2015, not so long ago, where the 2030 agenda was established in September 2015, the Paris Agreement in December 2015. This is a roadmap for all the organizations, public, private sector, civil society, our behavior as people in our homes. What should we do to migrate towards a low carbon society, a sustainable economy? It was clear then, and even way before, that there are huge financing gaps in order to implement the agenda that was determined. The financial sector is playing an essential role in moving capitals towards sustainable projects, towards the less advanced countries that have not a capacity to migrate to other economic schemes. So these financing methods reveal that the financing sector is the key to the transition towards a low carbon society. Now let's talk about the banks, the case of the banks. From HSBC, at HSBC, we are redefining the role of the banks as the engine of the traditional economies. Now we become partners of societies, the ally of people. We are the engine that can accompany them, help them migrate towards business models, towards activities and projects that are more sustainable. This redefinition of the roles played by the banks is not a minor thing. It's not just appointing a director and through the microphone determining net zero goals. That implies that the banks had to change skin totally. So I listened to Patty's and Gabriel's comments. At HSBC, in establishing a dialogue with the clients about their sustainability targets, what is it we can do at the corporate, government, trenches, markets, retail, physical persons? We can lay on the table these topics and find through our structures, products, and platforms a way to accompany our clients at all levels and all scopes and sectors to help them migrate and be the bank that produces these financial products to accompany them. In regards to the banks, what we've seen traditionally is after that statement several years ago, stating that the climate change threatens the stability of the financial system. Well, when this is clear, when this becomes clear, the banks start creating structures to identify risks in the financement models we provide. What risks threaten the banks when we implement a project or another? We are co-responsible of the externalities of the projects we fund. What happens to the credits in the projects? We are responsible for it. So let's talk risks. So the Equator principles a long time ago, where the banks in the world started categorizing the impacts of the funds and the financing methods we offer. Then we start seeing pressure of the disclosure. Okay, so what's the carbon print of your portfolios? We have to measure that. So we start producing data at the financial institutions. But the final part of your comment, Bane, how can banks be the engines to that transition? Well, the banks need to change skin, top to bottom, to create the financial products that can actually accompany our clients. At HSBC, we have climate risk structures, transition risks, sustainability risks. We have hours and hours of training for our corporates and officers to identify the systems, the risks stemming from every sector we fund and finance. But what are the opportunities working with our customers to have a positive impact in the realm of the projects we are financing? So it's not one team working in the sustainability concept. It's a bank that has changed its face. All its capacities are invested in this migration. So what's next for the banks? It's an ecosystem. Talking about Mexico, in the case of the Green Finance Board for regulators, the work carried out by the Ministry of Finance, there are efforts for national taxonomy, the Green Finance Consultation Board. We've created structures. The actors have sat around the table to accompany each other as we build our capacities to migrate together towards a sustainable financing ecosystem that is more sturdy. That's what we see in the world of actors of sustainable finance. And what do we see in our customers? Well, we see, of course, the markets are driving and exercising a constructive pressure on the companies to help them migrate to more sustainable models. We have also sustainability practices tested by the companies. We see the markets, the stocks exchange markets, the regulators, the new regulations in regard to disclosure of ESG companies in the U.S., in the United Kingdom. We see the regulation on climate risks in many areas of the world. So the companies are now transforming themselves, and this cascades down to the SMEs. In the value chain of these companies, they need to disclose their print, their emissions, and their value chain, the scope 3 of emissions. So we see it in our clients. They're more open to undertake a dialogue with us. We are building our capacities. I can tell you that in the first quarter of 2021 to the first quarter 2022 in Mexico, in amounts and transactions that are tagged as green transactions in HBC, we grew fivefold the number of operations that we carried out with our clients and the amounts. We have produced more capacities. We have totally changed our skin. So we have a great responsibility as commercial banking systems. The banks in Mexico are working closely with all the stakeholders, and many good things will derive from them in regard to financing the climate change and the green economy. Thank you. It is a pleasure to know that the pressure exists since it stems from international pledges, the national regulations, of course, the shareholders, the public at large, but that there is a response at the level of the banks, such as HSBC. So this presents a very positive landscape. So these advancements give a hope of a future and a path to be followed. Now, Alberto, the undersecretary spoke about ESGs. I think the topic, at least here, when we speak of public policies in relation with the entrepreneurial sector. Now, how far is this part of the private corporations, this concept of ESGs, this concept that will bring us to the next level, the mobilization of resources from the private sector, of course, based on the scope of the challenges and the urgency. And what do you think about this topic? The private sector gives employment, produces, invests, and most of the sustainable economy, although we have the public sector that creates an ecosystem of rules and incentives for the private sector to operate. At the end of the day, it's the private sector that will end up mobilizing most of the needed resources for this change. What do you think about this, Alberto? I'd love to hear your take on this. Thank you, Vanessa. Thank you, HSBC. Thank you, Chatham House, COMEXI, CAF. Thank you for the invitation. And I'm glad to be here with my colleagues and panelists, friends. I will go back to some of the elements you highlighted. Vanessa was speaking about the pledges and the pledges in time in regards to climate change. I think we've made great progress in terms of our commitments. And, well, the greatest challenge is the implementation of these initiatives. Sometimes we forget that 2050 is right around the corner and that the challenges and the goals we have devised for 2050 demand great efforts. Now, when I see the role that the global companies play, the ESG in Mexico represents 60 multinationals that have been in our country for over 100 years in many sectors of the economy, talking to the different companies. It is clear to me that the commitments are becoming more tangible. The goals that have been defined by the companies in regards to their direct responsibility without talking necessarily about scope 3. We have topics in the agro-industrial realm, water, renewables, recycling, more generation of electric power, renewables, reduction of scope 1 and scope 2 emissions. So we see great efforts. Now, however, I believe this does not suffice to lead us to the 2050 agenda. So the key is cooperation, as mentioned by Gabriel and Mariu. It's a collaboration between the different parties that will help us get to that goal. The energy grid, we're not investing enough to meet the challenge in regards to the energy offer. I'm not talking about the type of energy, over $300 billion that need to be invested, but maybe we need 5 times more investment. So in regards to the energy sources, we need more investments in the midst of the pandemic in 2021, the increase in the demand for electric power in China for manufacturing processes equaled all the entire energy and power offers that exist in the United Kingdom. So this has to do with the development, the growth. But we need to highlight the climate change, the energy transition. So most of the fluids, oil fluids, go to vehicle consumption and automobile consumption, a great percentage. Today we have 1.2 billion vehicles, and out of these 1.2 billion vehicles, 60 million are electric vehicles now. And last year, for instance, 9% of the vehicles that were sold, around 6 million vehicles, were electric vehicles. So this is growing at a swift pace that is positive, but at a minor impact. These vehicles have reduced the demand for oil, maybe 500,000 daily barrels out of the 100 million we consume every day. Well, maybe it's a little spot, and where we've seen more impacts, it's in the motorcycles and two, three wheeled vehicles, where the reduction in the demand for oil is around 1 million barrels. However, there's still much to be done. If we look at the commitments of the global companies in Mexico, over 90% of the global companies in Mexico have already pledges to decarbonize, and 80% have pledged to become totally electric and working with electric power and renewable energies. So we have 10 countries that concentrate 80% of the production of electric powers through solar or aeolian sources and mechanisms. So the growth is still insignificant. Yes, going the right way. Yes, the private sector is deeply engaged. We can have access to the financing schemes these stockholders demanded, otherwise they won't invest in our projects. The employees are needed because otherwise they would not be working with us. So there's a regulation, but to me the key is the speed at which we are currently implementing it, and the question is, will we get to the 2050 target? Yes, I'm optimistic, but the challenge is humongous. So we need to double our efforts. And I think the Russian invasion of Ukraine has challenged the energy security, and the production of energy has been challenged. And I'm optimistic. We need a collaboration from the civil society, companies, government, and hopefully we will reach the goals we established as a planet. And as you said as we say um, the jargon of the United Nations, this is a shared responsibility. You spoke about the energy production, uh, the consumption patterns that are going the right way, but still with a limited scope. And I'd like to give the word to Patricia Espinosa. She was participating in two panels in Davos, and she has to go to the next one. So, Patty, you have the floor in case you want to make a final your final remarks. And thank you for participating in the Latin America 2022 Chatham House conference. It was a pleasure to share our viewpoints. And as an executive secretary of the Convention on Climate Change, it is encouraging to listen to these comments, to see how the engagement in regard to sustainability and climate change, it's growing, the work is growing, but we need to speed this up. At the panel, we spoke about the scenario 2050. But the truth is that to get to 2050, first there's 2030 with concrete advancements. Because if we cannot do it in the forthcoming 8 years, whatever we laid on the table, whatever we have planned for 2050, just simply will be impossible, just plain impossible. So I'd like to make a reflection here, make it aloud. This is a time of inflection in the history of humanity, time when the decision makers have the great opportunity to define how the future of the world will be like. We have inherited the results of the Industrial Revolution processes that were implemented, and that's how we built a development model that is still that is currently showing it is getting exhausted, that it is not feasible anymore. So this is when the deciders at all levels, in all countries, in all sectors must decide whether we are going to keep on that path of destruction, of utter destruction, or open up these new paths. I know change is difficult, but these are paths of opportunity for Mexico, for our children, for the economy. And I also thank your comment, Vanessa. The fact that the economy is still being debated as something totally detached from the climate change, that implies a tremendous risk. We should not stick to that path. And we should not keep on compartmentalizing the different sectors as if it were nothing. The climate change is at the core of the social and economic development of every single country, so we have a huge task ahead of us. Thank you for your efforts. Thank you, Vane, for this beautiful opportunity to share my reflections and thoughts with you. And again, my apologies for having to leave you. Good luck in Davos, and we'll keep in touch. And the panel is has come to an end. We still have a couple of minutes to keep on discussing. I'd like to raise some questions, ask questions to the panel, and please, in 3 minutes, give us an answer to help us in case there is a question from the audience. Now, our, the sub-governor Jonathan Keith said that we need to cross our fingers to not see any more clashes and any more disruptions. Now, my question, Undersecretary, is how well prepared is Mexico currently? How well prepared are the public finances today to uh, meet a high or a brutal climate change clash? One thing is to see how to reduce, abate the risks. I know you are abating the risks, but there they are. And against nature, there's nothing we can do. We have never been able to forecast anything nor know when these events will hit us. So how well prepared are the public finances to meet any situation? And Alberto, if you wrote a letter to Santa from the government, and since to in terms of the policies, incentives, regulations that are needed to make your life easier in regard to the work regarding the climate change, how would your life be made easier if you wrote a letter to Santa? Well, well, I have the opportunity to make a reflection here. When we started analyzing the impact of public finances, the fiscal contingencies in the macroeconomic context, the first thing we identify are the inflation, the impacts from inflation, the growth, how the exchange rate will move and change. So we have implemented clear policies to stabilize the public debt, to not use more debt. The debt has been stabilized at 50%. So this is a decision, a policy. Although the stabilization funds have not been touched, we have not been able to capture more money following the rule. If we have more money after what has been scheduled, the buffers we have produced from previous years have been kept at the Ministry of Finance. There are buffers that will allow us to absorb the external clashes. That has been the policy followed by the Ministry of Finance. Even Vanessa uh, um, helped make these decisions. But I close with the following reception. Since the pandemic, there are offer clashes and shocks. But after COVID, we have recurring offers and subsequent tides. We we started providing services, but then the war against Ukraine has interrupted value chains. We have now some inputs that are become scarce, and we are seeing other offer clashes such as pandemics in farm animals and the lack of production because we don't have the grains and seeds we need. So what we are currently seeing are the effects of climate change that are becoming tangible in the lack of food and the lack of water to keep up the productivity of our harvests and and crops, and we're seeing that. Or listening to one of the CEOs from HSBC, we saw a fall in the productivity of some in food inputs, and we spoke also about accelerating the convergence and the speed. And Marisa spoke about behavioral change. If we don't realize that. A former officer spoke about a great event that's coming up. So if we still have expectations that there will be a great event, yes, there will be a major event because we're not acting on the short term. So the famous chasm is here. We're seeing it in the production of seeds. The countries are starting to make their own decisions. So public finances, we have healthy financing finance system, but let's not wait for a major clash to happen that will not allow us to react, not only in our country, but the rest of the countries. When this happens, everybody starts making their own decisions, and that is not the situation where the world wants to find itself. So we have a healthy fiscal situation, and our finances are well controlled, but the world is not realizing that the famous black swan will be here. There'll be a lack of food, droughts. India closed at export. So that is a reality. And regardless of hurricanes, regardless of floods, this is already a reality, an economic reality. And at some point, we will start talking about the impact of financial stability. But part of the inflation has been triggered by all this. Thank you. Thank you, Gabriel.
Thank you very much, Gabriel. So, our letter Santa, Gabriel. No, I would like to say, okay, I've talked in my first segment about the ecosystem that we're generating, regulators, and the financial system in general, and all systems across sustainable finance. But I would underscore that there are banks such as HSBC with a global strategy. We have so much to do vis-a-vis sustainable finance and maximum in pre-regulatory arena, just out of commitment, simply so as to transform the bank, the transit, to become those who walk hand in hand with the customers in this, that it is imperative for other banks, smaller banks, to hop on. We have full research departments throughout the world. We bring them over to Mexico. We also generate R&D. So in the financial sector, there's so many institutions that are smaller than we are. And the regulatory environment has happened with CONSAR and the pension funds there, which now by law are incorporating ESGs into the decision making. This is something for which there'll be a huge push in terms of banks, and this will lead to more and better communication and a development building. Another point here is that large companies are facing pressure from the markets. We have seen that they have the structures and the resources for sustainable equipment. Companies in the local stock market are now working on these lines, but we also have to integrate small and medium businesses here, but they do not have the tools or the ability to measure and to know how to transform themselves. So let it to Santa Claus. Beyond what is currently being built in terms of work groups, national taxonomies, there's a need for an ongoing effort to integrate the largest group of businesses in Mexico, which is small and medium businesses. Thank you so much, Alberto. Thank you. Oh, Gabriel, there's so much to do. You've got homework. But I would say, speaking on behalf of the private sector, that what we need at the end of the day is clean energy. We need affordable energy. We need abundant energy. And I believe that the talk that we recently had on the electric sector reform has taken us in the opposite direction from what we need. And so when we look at what was discussed in Congress translates into, well, I believe that we have so much more to do. I read a headline, there was an article which said that after the 2013 reform, well, there were blackouts now, and I would say no. This is a result of the fact that this was not implemented fully. This was not accelerated, and that is the reason we now face the challenges we face. So I would say that we have to speed things up in that regard. One single company cannot do everything on its own, and on our side, the companies that consume electric energy, well, what we want is for there to be a great many more sources of renewable, clean energy. Today, there are companies that demand clean energy certificates, which are impossible to obtain in Mexico, and they have to get them through clean energy certificates in California or other places, because Mexico does not, is far from being able to provide what the private sector needs. So I think that the government could truly help fostering competencies in this regard, fostering the use of clean renewable energies and giving everyone access to such energies in a competitive manner. Thank you so much, Alberto. And
los ojos para Sergio Alcocer, a ver si hay alguna pregunta ahí en la sala y que las podamos ir atendiendo.
Gracias, Vanessa. Como diría el clásico, arriba a la izquierda.
Gracias.
Carlos Camacho, por favor.
Muchas gracias.
Mr. Undersecretary, congratulations for everything you're accomplishing at the government, pension funds, sustainable taxonomies, which is very clear, as you will do at SEC tomorrow, carbon bonds and so on and so forth. I believe that this ongoing collaboration with the private sector, I think everything is going along swimmingly. But these ESG criteria, do they apply to state-owned companies in terms of budgeting? And if that is the case, I would...
Gracias, Carlos. Si te parece, seguimos Pilar Álvarez y posteriormente Roberto Dondich y después contestamos. Adelante, Pilar, por favor.
Thank you so much. Good day and congratulations for the event. And I thank you for extending this vision to what is being done in Mexico from the point of view of both the public and private sectors, since this is an international forum and since we are obligated as a country, as has been mentioned in this panel, we are obligated to meet with our international commitments that that we have subscribed. Well, I would like to ask first, what innovations have been introduced or do you feel must be introduced in terms of public policy? That is a question regarding the future. There's a lot that has been done, but there's a lot more to be done. So what needs to be done in terms of mitigation, in terms of climate change, above all, and if you'd like also to take on the topic of adaptation. And the other point, something that already exists and that's now frozen in what already exists and what is currently frozen in Congress. Thank you very much. I have two questions. The first is to do with Pilar's question, but I would take it on from a slightly different point of view. You have talked a lot about innovations, and this has been incredible in terms of financing mechanisms for finance. How do we implement this in terms of public policy such that we can meet with our commitments, the Paris Accord? And the other question is, will we meet our commitments for those of us who were there and we presented at some point? And the other point is, when we negotiated Paris, there was an important point that remained open, which is technological transfer, which is very important for Latin America. This is a point which is still being worked on. So what is your stance on technological transfer such that Latin America can not only meet with its commitments, but also to grow its commitment within the context of the cycles as defined by the Paris Accord? Thank you very much. Well, I will try to answer summarily. The taxonomical approach has the objective of accomplishing the very same thing that certain investment funds are already accomplishing, which is that when a buyer needs specific criteria for climate change, sustainability criteria, whatever it may be, this will induce certain behaviors on behalf of the issuing parties. And likewise, what we want to accomplish with these taxonomies in the financial market, in the Mexican financial sector, this is not something that we're doing on our own on the public side. We're working with the private sector, with the Committee for Sustainable Financing. A lot of you here participate, are part of that, and we want the market to align incentives. And so this trend will be consolidated in the measure that we establish such criteria in terms of financial regulation. Now, what can public-owned companies do? Well, they have been adopting ESGs. The electricity producing company has been doing so, and Pemex is also moving along in that regard. And most of those who give them credit have been requesting that, enforcing that. And as for fuel for aircraft and so on, it's very likely that they will have to speed up a plan in the transition toward the implementation of ESGs. It could be regulatory, but we believe the market will be the fundamental force, the cornerstone on which we are building public policy in terms of green finance. And so that all of us are forced to incorporate such criteria, and it could be at a government level, at a private level, across the board. And if you would allow, I was talking about behavior changes, and please forgive me if I sound repetitive, but much of the growth that we have seen across all productive sectors, this is all linked not only to activities that many of which are not friendly toward the environment, and it is hard to decouple such activities given the impacts that they generate. So I don't know. I'm trying to speak as clearly as possible, but if we stop oil extractions, oil drilling, the impacts in terms of unemployment will be huge. And we have probably seen this in previous years in Mexico, in oil-producing regions. There was huge growth in social issues when this happened. So the transition we need is an orderly, balanced transition with technological transfer, mediated by technological transfer. But these types of shocks and the preferences of countries, oftentimes it seems, are changing. Before the COVID crisis hit, investors would tell me, they would ask about Pemex now. They're asking about COVID now. They're talking about the war. COVID is now behind us, would seem. But what we have to keep a focus on in terms of public policy is our objectives there. And I believe that the Russia-Ukraine conflict is brought about a step backwards in terms of climate change because of the dependencies that certain regions of Europe have and to Russian oil and gas. And what will happen, I believe that they will invest ever more in green technologies, but the focus here is to try to reduce this dependency, this lack of self-sufficiency in terms of energy production, because without energy there can be no growth. So this transition, this orderly transition is, I believe, what we need, what we have to plan for quite carefully, because if it is moved too fast, then it's dangerous, and if it's too slow, then we will not accomplish what we have set out to do. And someone said something about international forums and what's missing in that regard. Well, we have been, the agenda for sustainable finance, I think that we have accomplished quite a lot, but there's also much more to accomplish. We have talked to executives at HSBC. We've been talking about green mortgages. This is not, we're not inventing the wheel here. This exists already elsewhere. This is linked to the creation of infrastructure, housing infrastructure, and this is one of the paths that we can develop in terms of infrastructure, of ecosystems and public policy. The government, we have mapped results-based budgeting practices, but we need public investment management also with ESG criteria. What Mexico usually does, what Mexico usually lacks, better still in contrast to other economies, countries, is that we do not have a central planning agency for infrastructure. For instance, Colombia is in the other end of the spectrum. They have a national department for planning. So Mexico has not had such an entity for a great many years. I won't say when this happened, because he is here, but at some point it was decided to get rid of the Department of Planning. So we need to incorporate ESG criteria in decision making, in public policy, and in the use of public funds. So I believe that this is one of the key elements that needs strengthening, but we do not have an institutional design for that. Still, we don't have that yet. That is something that we need. I do not believe in the Colombian model, for instance, in a centralized model, because we are a much larger country. But Brazil has something of that nature, and this is something that we may model on. The carbon bonds is something we have to develop. International pressures will lead to these reductions to be obligatory. For some countries, it is currently by choice. So we see the market as the force that will align incentives in this regard in terms of financial regulations. What we want to accomplish is to raise the bar as much as possible, working hand in hand with the private sector. We do not want to impose rules that could inhibit economic growth. So we have to work hand in hand in order to calibrate public policy. Thank you very much. We have time for one more question. Briefly, thank you very much. Thank you for this panel. My question was for Patricia Espinosa, but deforestation. This is one of the most terrible issues that we saw last year with fires last year, the loss of land surface covered by forests and the farms and that you participate. I truly hope that this remains a priority, and local incentives that are quite perverse in the sense that they incentivize crops and then forester land is reduced ever more. And the other point is around the industry. When you have a product which is produced, is transformed, there's a value added part of the cycle. It's a whole cycle, production, consumption, and in my opinion, therefore, it has also a fiscal life cycle. What we need, I believe, is to incorporate the full potential of industry holds in terms of recycling, lining financial incentives, such as if these products have met with their fiscal responsibilities, then we need a 0% rate in terms of integrating recycling into financial structures. So my suggestion is to project an economy of recycling, and we need incentives in that regard. So if these products have met with their fiscal life cycle, then they need to be 0% in this sense. So informal economies, in the way that they're incorporated into such systems, we need to move forward in terms of the challenge that we face coming into 2030. And 2030 seems we're far cry from accomplishing our goals if we look at pollution levels. Well, I think that it's a great idea to take on the issue of circular economy. I'm taking notes. This will be my homework. But I forgot to answer somebody else's question. The one on what commitments. Mexico has ratified its commitments, and if you allow the linking of financial innovation to innovation in the sphere of public policy, and whether we will meet our commitments. We have ratified our commitments, and the argument that we have been making is that we do not necessarily have to work hand in hand with the energy sector in this world, or to decouple this, because disruptions to production can lead to social issues. So we need to balance both issues, social issues, environmental issues, and take on both. And what must we do in addition to that? And this is more to do with environmental authorities. So they have been thinking about circular economies, biodiversity, and so on, such that we may meet with these commitments. And this is linked not only to the energy sector, but also other actions in our economy that will lead to the full accomplishment of these objectives. What happens here in terms of sustainable finance in order to align incentives? We are building out this curve, but we have seen an ongoing trend where financial instruments have been incorporating development goals, results-based goals, indicators. So this is the reason for which it is important to have a true focus on sustainability here. When we have such instruments, it's possible that there will be immediate financial costs that will be passed on to those who do not meet with these goals. This is being done with corporations, and this is always done in the private sector before it's done in the public sector. And I'm certain that certain corporations in Mexico and certain financial instruments will start innovating along these lines with such instruments, but we will have a deeper ecosystem, a more developed ecosystem, and we're moving as fast as possible in order to accomplish this. Thank you very much, Undersecretary. Vanessa. Thank you. I have nothing to add after
lo bien que se ha dicho.
All of what has been said, it has been very well put. It is a pleasure to have had the chance to share this space with colleagues and friends, and in 10 minutes we will continue the program. Thank you so much.
Un aplauso a los panelistas. Muchas gracias.